The alchemist stands before the athanor, the philosophical furnace, not as a naive transmuter of base metals into gold, but as an individual confronting the most terrifying laboratory of all, the human psyche. This is not the alchemy of medieval charlatans hawking elixirs in marketplace shadows. This is the Magnum Opus, the great work, understood as it was always intended by the true adepts, as a profound technology of consciousness, a systematic unmasking of the constructed self. The genesis of this particular inquiry begins not with curiosity, but with crisis. Something fractures in the carefully maintained edifice of identity. Perhaps it arrives as sudden loss, as radical disillusionment, or as the slow accumulation of contradictions that can no longer be reconciled. The personality that once seemed solid reveals itself as provisional, constructed, fragile. In Jungian terminology, this moment marks the beginning of individuation. But the alchemists recognized this threshold long before modern depth psychology codified it into clinical language. What drives an individual toward such dangerous self-examination? It is rarely comfort. The alchemical tradition understood something fundamental. Transformation requires heat, pressure, dissolution. The prima materia, the original substance of the work, must be identified not in external materials, but in the raw, unexamined contents of one's own psychological life. The ego, that organizing principle of consciousness, which narrates our experience and maintains our sense of continuity, becomes both the subject and object of investigation. This initial spark is terrifying precisely because it threatens the only thing we believe ourselves to possess with certainty, our identity. The alchemists spoke of the nigredo, the blackening, as the first major phase of transformation. In psychological terms, this corresponds to the dismantling of persona, the collapse of cherished self-concepts, the recognition that what we have called I is largely a collection of adopted behaviors, internalized voices and defensive strategies. The genuine alchemical work begins only when one can no longer retreat into comfortable self-deception, when the question, who am I beneath these constructions, becomes not philosophical entertainment, but existential necessity. The architectural foundation of alchemical philosophy rests upon a radical premise, that macrocosm and microcosm are reflections of a single reality, and that the processes observed in nature provide templates for inner transformation. This is not poetic metaphor, but operational methodology. When Paracelsus declared that the book of nature is written by the finger of God, he articulated a principle central to all genuine esoteric work, that the universe itself instructs those capable of reading its signs. The alchemical doctrine begins with a diagnostic observation. Humanity exists in a state of fragmentation, suffering, and ignorance, not because of external circumstances, but because of internal disharmony. The microcosm, the individual human being, contains the same principles and potentials as the macrocosm, the universe itself, but in a state of disorder and latency. The metals of the alchemical work represent psychological states and qualities. Lead is not merely dense matter, but the weight of unconsciousness, of unexamined conditioning. Gold is not simply a precious metal, but the integrated conscious self that has undergone complete refinement. Central to this doctrine is the concept of the prima materia, the first matter. In external alchemy, this was the starting substance, often described in deliberately obscure terms, the stone that is not a stone, found everywhere yet recognized by few. In psychological alchemy, the prima materia is the totality of one's unprocessed psychological content. The repressed memories, the shadow impulses, the projections, the complexes, the inherited patterns. It is everything that consciousness has refused to acknowledge as belonging to itself. The alchemical operation proceeds through a series of stages, each representing a specific mode of psychological work. The solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, is not merely procedural instruction but philosophical principle. One must first dissolve the rigid structures of ego identification, allowing the personality to temporarily liquefy into its constituent parts before any genuine reorganization can occur. This dissolution is not destruction, but necessary analysis, the separation of authentic self from accumulated conditioning. Jung recognized in alchemy a complete symbolic system for the individuation process. His insight was not that alchemists were really doing psychology, but that both enterprises were approaching the same fundamental reality from different angles. The Alchemical Opus provided a detailed roadmap for the transformation of consciousness, encoded in material operations, to protect this knowledge from both persecution and premature exposure to those unprepared for its implications. The doctrine insists upon three essential principles: sulfur, mercury, and salt, representing spirit, soul, and body, or in psychological terms, will, imagination, and embodied experience. Transformation requires the integration and balanced development of all three. Pure intellectualism fails because it neglects the body. Pure emotionalism fails because it lacks the stabilizing principle of structure. Pure physicalism fails because it denies the reality of subjective experience. The alchemist does not work alone. The texts speak of the sora mystica, the mystical sister or inner companion, representing the anima or animus in Jungian terms, that contrasexual aspect of the psyche which must be recognized and integrated. The relationship between operator and inner other becomes the crucible in which transformation occurs. This is why the royal marriage, the conjunctio, represents the culmination of the alchemical process, the reconciliation of seemingly irreconcilable opposites within the unified self. What distinguishes authentic alchemical doctrine from mere occult fantasy is its insistence on ordeal. There are no shortcuts, no magical formulae that bypass the actual work of confronting one's own depths. The texts are deliberately obscure, not to conceal simple truths from the unworthy, but because certain knowledge can only be earned through direct experience. To describe the taste of transformation to one who has not undergone it is as futile as describing color to one born blind. The doctrine promises not transcendence of human limitation, but its complete acceptance and transfiguration. The gold produced is not an escape from lead, but lead fully realized, consciousness brought to complete clarity about its own nature. This is the profound wisdom the tradition guards, that enlightenment is not the acquisition of something new, but the removal of obscurations from what has always been present. The alchemical journey unfolds through distinct phases, each corresponding to a particular quality of psychological transformation. These stages are not merely sequential, but recursive, spiral rather than linear, each phase containing echoes of all others. Nigredo, the blackening, the descent. The work begins in darkness. The nigredo represents the confrontation with everything the ego has excluded from its sense of identity. Jung called this the encounter with the shadow, that aspect of the personality containing all the characteristics, impulses, and potentials that consciousness has rejected as incompatible with its self-image. The alchemical texts describe this phase with imagery of death, decay, putrefaction. The philosophical substance must be reduced to its most basic state, stripped of all superficial qualities. In practical psychological terms, the nigredo arrives as depression, disillusionment, the collapse of meaning structures. Everything that once seemed certain becomes questionable. Relationships reveal themselves as built on projection and unconscious patterns. Career achievements appear hollow. Spiritual beliefs that provided comfort now seem like elaborate defense mechanisms against genuine self-knowledge. This is not pathology, but necessary groundwork. The individual entering this phase experiences what mystics call the dark night of the soul, but the alchemical perspective provides crucial guidance. This darkness is not failure, but furnace. The heat of psychological suffering serves a precise function. It breaks down the rigid structure of persona, those social masks worn for so long they have been mistaken for the face beneath. The terror of the nigredo lies in its dissolution of boundaries. One discovers that the enemy is not external but internal, that the qualities most despised in others are projections of disowned aspects of self. The work of the nigredo is uncomfortable but clear. One must acknowledge and name the shadow contents. This means confronting one's capacity for cruelty, selfishness, manipulation, and cowardice. It means recognizing how trauma has shaped perception, how childhood patterns continue to structure adult relationships, how unexamined beliefs dictate behavior, There is no possibility of authentic transformation without this descent into the personal underworld. Albedo, the whitening, the purification. From the blackness of complete dissolution emerges the albedo, the whitening. In laboratory alchemy, this was the appearance of a white substance after the blackening of calcination. In psychological alchemy, it represents the emergence of clarity, the beginning of discrimination between authentic self and imposed conditioning. This is the moonlight phase, the development of reflective consciousness. The albedo brings relief after the intensity of the nigredo, but this relief carries its own danger. The individual may mistake this phase for completion, settling into a calm detachment that is merely sophisticated avoidance rather than genuine integration. The albedo is purification, but not yet vivification. Consciousness has achieved distance from the ego's identification with its contents, but has not yet fully animated the new structure emerging from the work. This phase corresponds to what Buddhism calls vipassana, clear seeing. One develops the capacity to observe thoughts, emotions, and sensations without immediate identification. The witness consciousness strengthens, but the witness alone is incomplete. Pure observation without engagement can become a spiritual bypass, a way of avoiding embodied existence under the guise of detachment. The work of the albedo involves careful discrimination. Which patterns serve growth and which serve merely comfort? Which relationships foster consciousness and which enable unconsciousness? Which aspects of identity are authentic expressions and which are defensive constructions? This is delicate work, requiring both honesty and compassion. The temptation toward harsh self-judgment must be balanced against the necessity for clear assessment. The appearance of the white stone, the albedo's signature image, represents the development of what alchemists called the philosophical mercury, the fluid, adaptive aspect of consciousness that can move between states without losing coherence. In psychological terms, this is the capacity for genuine flexibility, the ability to hold multiple perspectives without collapsing into relativism or rigidity. Citrinitas, the yellowing, the dawn. Some traditions place citrinitas as a distinct phase between whitening and reddening, representing the first appearance of color, the dawn breaking after the long night. This is the phase of illumination, when genuine insight begins to emerge not as abstract knowledge, but as lived understanding. The citrinitas brings moments of profound realization, often experienced as sudden clarity about long-standing patterns. These are not merely intellectual insights, but full-body recognitions that reorganize perception. The individual sees with shocking clarity how a particular defensive strategy has shaped decades of behavior, or how a single traumatic moment has colored all subsequent relationships. These illuminations can be joyful or devastating, but they are always liberating because they restore agency. What was unconscious pattern becomes conscious choice. This phase often brings what Jung called synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to reflect the internal work in external circumstances. The alchemists understood these not as supernatural interventions, but as natural consequences of increased consciousness. When one pays attention differently, one notices different things. The universe has not changed, but one's capacity to read its signs has deepened. Rubedo, the reddening, the embodiment. The final major phase is the rubedo, the reddening, representing full embodiment of the transformed consciousness. This is symbolized by the philosopher's stone, the red elixir, the gold that does not tarnish. In psychological terms, this is the achievement of what Jung called the self, not the ego self, but the totality of the psyche consciously integrated. The rubedo is characterized by full engagement with life, no longer from a position of unconscious reaction, but from grounded presence. The individual who has completed this phase does not transcend human emotion, but experiences it fully without being controlled by it. Anger arises when appropriate and passes when its energy has been expressed. Grief is felt completely and then released. Joy is embraced without clinging to its continuation. This phase requires what the alchemists called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites. masculine and feminine principles within the psyche, conscious and unconscious, spirit and matter must be brought into dynamic balance. This is not the elimination of tension, but its transformation into creative friction. The rubedo personality contains contradiction without being fragmented by it. The philosopher's stone, the ultimate product of the alchemical work, possesses three properties. It transmutes base metal to gold, it heals all disease, and it extends life. Psychologically decoded, it transforms unconscious patterns into conscious capacity. It heals the fragmentation of the psyche, and it allows one to live fully in each moment rather than merely existing in habitual reactivity. This is the completion of the great work. But completion is never final. The alchemical wheel turns again. Each integration reveals new depths requiring attention. The Magnum Opus is not accomplished once, but continuously renewed, a spiral of ever-deepening consciousness that continues until death itself becomes the final solve, the ultimate dissolution. At the heart of the alchemical journey lies an unavoidable encounter with what might be called existential despair, though this term fails to capture the full terror of the experience. This is the moment when all constructions have been dismantled, all meaning systems have revealed their inadequacy, and yet the new has not yet crystallized into coherent form. The alchemists called this the moment of greatest danger, when the operator might be destroyed by the very forces they have unleashed. This crisis is not peripheral to the work, but its very core. The ego must experience its own mortality while consciousness continues. One discovers that the sense of self that has organized all experience is itself constructed, contingent, and ultimately ungraspable. This recognition produces a vertiginous terror that cannot be adequately described to one who has not experienced it. Every foundation reveals itself as built on sand. Every certainty dissolves into question. The phenomenology of this crisis involves a fundamental ontological insecurity. The individual cannot retreat to previously comforting identifications because they have been consciously deconstructed. Yet no new stable identity has emerged. There is awareness without a clear sense of who or what is aware. Relationships become complex because one can no longer unconsciously project and identify. Work loses its meaning when career accomplishments are recognized as ego compensation for lack of genuine self-knowledge. Even spiritual practices can become hollow when one sees through their defensive functions. What makes this crisis particularly acute is its isolation. One cannot adequately communicate the experience to those who have not undergone similar unraveling. Well-meaning friends and family, operating from their own unconscious patterns, offer advice that entirely misses the nature of the crisis. Find yourself, they say, not understanding that the very concept of a findable self is what has collapsed. Do what makes you happy, they suggest, not grasping that happiness itself has been revealed as a constructed state dependent on maintaining certain fictions. The alchemical texts provide a crucial framework for contextualizing this experience. They make clear that this dismantling is not pathology, but necessary passage. The nigredo must be entered fully, not resisted. The temptation is to grasp at any available meaning system, to rush toward premature reintegration, to settle for a slightly modified version of the previous personality structure. But genuine transformation requires complete willingness to remain in the crucible until the work is done. Jung noted that his patients who successfully navigated this terrain often exhibited similar characteristics. They developed a relationship to something beyond the ego, whether conceptualized as the self, the collective unconscious, or the transcendent function. This is not regression to religious literalism, but discovery of what might be called the religious function, the capacity to relate to something greater than personal identity without losing discriminating consciousness. The crisis demands a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with heroic action. It is the courage to continue breathing when breath seems meaningless, to continue existing when existence has no clear purpose, to remain present to experience when experience has become almost unbearable in its intensity and emptiness simultaneously. This is what the mystics meant by surrender, not passive resignation, but active acceptance of the totality of one's experience without defense. Physical symptoms often accompany this psychological crisis. The body, responding to the dissolution of organizing patterns, may manifest mysterious illnesses, exhaustion, or psychosomatic complaints. The alchemists understood this connection between psyche and soma. The work of transformation cannot be purely mental. The body must be brought through the process as well. This is why authentic traditions always include physical practices, not as mere preparation for spiritual development, but as integral to the transformation itself. There is a profound paradox at the heart of this crisis. The very despair that seems to threaten annihilation is simultaneously the condition for breakthrough. The ego must die, but consciousness continues. What emerges on the other side is not a new ego, but a transformed relationship to ego function. The self is recognized as process rather than entity, as verb rather than noun. This recognition brings both terror and liberation in equal measure. What emerges from the alchemical ordeal is not a perfected personality, but a transformed relationship to personality itself. The individual who has completed the essential phases of the work does not transcend human limitation, but inhabits it with fundamentally different consciousness. This is the product of the Magnum Opus. Not gold as metal, but consciousness as gold, refined through repeated heating and cooling, dissolution and coagulation, until it shines with clarity. The integrated individual retains the capacity for ego function, but is no longer identified exclusively with ego. There is an awareness that watches the watcher, a presence that remains continuous even as thoughts, emotions, and circumstances change. This is not dissociation, but integration at a higher level. The personality continues to operate, but it is recognized as an instrument rather than the totality of being. This new relationship to self manifests in practical ways. Reactivity decreases because one can observe emotional impulses arising without immediately identifying with them. This does not mean becoming emotionless, but rather experiencing emotions fully without being controlled by them. Anger still arises when boundaries are violated, but it serves its function and passes rather than colonizing consciousness for hours or days. Sadness is felt completely rather than defended against, and thus moves through the system more cleanly. Relationships transform because projection diminishes. When one has confronted and integrated significant shadow material, there is less need to disown aspects of self by seeing them only in others. This does not make relationships easier in the sense of requiring less work, but it makes them cleaner. Conflicts arise from genuine difference rather than from unconscious material being acted out. Communication becomes more direct because defensive structures have been examined and partially dismantled. The integration phase requires patience because the temptation is always present to grasp at the fruits of the work, to turn insight into spiritual accomplishment, to construct a new identity around having completed the process. But the deepest realization of the alchemical work is that there is no static completion. The philosopher's stone is not an object possessed, but a capacity maintained through continued attention and practice. Creative capacity often increases after the essential integration has occurred. This is not because one has acquired new skills, but because internal obstacles have been removed. The energy previously devoted to maintaining defensive structures becomes available for genuine expression. There is less concern with how others perceive one's work, because the need for external validation has diminished. One creates not to prove something to oneself or others, but as natural expression of consciousness, engaging with form. The relationship to death also transforms. Having undergone multiple symbolic deaths through the alchemical process, the fear of literal death often diminishes. This does not mean welcoming death or being careless with life, but rather holding one's existence more lightly. There is less desperate clinging, because the fundamental ground of being has been contacted directly and is recognized as continuous even as individual personality dissolves. Perhaps most significantly, the integrated individual develops what might be called ontological humor, the capacity to hold the full tragedy and comedy of human existence simultaneously. Life is recognized as both profoundly meaningful and utterly absurd, as both sacred and mundane, as both determined and free. This paradoxical vision allows engagement with existence that is neither nihilistic nor naively optimistic, but fully present to what is. The alchemical work produces not saints, but authentic human beings, flawed, limited, mortal creatures who have nevertheless achieved a remarkable degree of consciousness about their own nature, and have learned to live from that consciousness rather than in unconscious reaction to it. This is the gold that does not tarnish, not perfection but lucidity, not transcendence but complete presence, not escape from the human condition but its full conscious embodiment. The gold you seek does not rest in the crucible, but in the will that kindles the flame.